Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to have Jay Townley here again. This is part one of a four-part SuperWebinar series designed for the entire industry to keep us informed on the current status of the supply chain, while specifically highlighting areas in which retailers and the industry alike should be looking to pivot to continue to find success and profitability. Speaking with Jay just a moment ago, he was even adding to this webinar this morning. There's such turbulence happening right now, and the NBDA wants to keep everyone informed. These presentations are formatted by Jay with data collected from top industry sources. It features, like I said, the most up-to-date information available. And so all presentations will start with a review of the past, talk about what's happening currently, and look at the future. This is a time for learning and growth. At the end of the presentation, I know Jay will be available for question and answer. This is part one, as I said, of a four-part series. We'll have another one in winter, in December, again in February, and then once again in spring of 22 in April. Jay, we thank you so much for your continued partnership with the NBDA. And then with this, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. My thanks both to Heather and Michelle for keeping me both on screen and keeping me going here. I agree. This is an extremely important series. And please let Heather and Michelle know both if you have questions now. And between these important webinars, the next one, this is fall 21. We'll have another one this December on the 21st. You'll notice we also are scheduled into 2022 in February. And then lastly, in the spring, and certainly we can do more if the situation shifts dramatically. But this is the start of what I think will also be a series of articles that we'll be doing at HBS and that we'll be sharing with the NBDA and also with Brain. I'm going to kill my video at this point and see if I can advance my slides here. For those of you that have been with me before with this, you might recall that this is the big question mark for me, is getting to the next slide. I keep pushing the button. Ah, here we go. Here we are. And actually we got the animation with it. Supply chain nightmare. As Heather said, this is a factual and a current look at the bicycle business supply chain. And we're going to focus on what bike shops, which you guys and our suppliers and associate members can take away and use to improve profitability, and particularly for the bike shops to grow their locally owned businesses. Now, this webinar, as I said, is the first in a series of four. And we've given you the dates. If you need to get those repeated, they're on the NBDA website. So this is part one, fall 21, 2021. And we're going to take a look at the agenda so that we can begin to idea of what this morning in the time we have is going to be all about. We're going to talk about the bicycle supply chain, the order and forecast flow. And we've got a new graphic I was describing to Heather and Rochelle that we're going to share with you that you're going to see more of as we get into this. We also want to be sure that we're clear about why we're having this supply chain nightmare, and that is the role the consumer plays in this, the American consumer. The fact that we are an import-dependent market is extremely important to understand, and we're going to look at that graphically. We're going to take a look at the supply chain and logistics as a rolling definition of normal. And we discussed this a month ago, but this is important to understand that this is not a fixed stake in the ground definition for the bike industry. We have this shifting rolling definition, and we'll explain that and show you the examples. And for bike shops, we're going to spend some time looking at how you need to look at staying flexible and to thinking outside the box. And as I mentioned to Heather this morning, it's also important that you begin to think in terms of retention. Customer retention becomes extremely important as we look to the future, which we'll discuss in some detail. And then we're going to open this up for questions and answers. Now, here's the new graphic I mentioned: bicycle supply chain order and forecast flow. I'll walk you through this. Take a look at it, study it. There's actually 19 individual steps that are normal in this bicycle supply chain as it exists today. To the far left is Asia, starting with raw material, the conveyance or freight to the component manufacturers with some subassembly, and then conveyance or freight to the OEM, the original equipment manufacturing plant, who brings in the containers, who schedules the freight of the full containers to the Asian port, to the ocean freight, to the US port, where the container goes on to some kind of truck transportation to a fulfillment center, a warehouse, a distribution center, a brand warehouse somewhere in the United States, where it in turn is shipped to the bike shop or to the retailers that sell bicycles, mass merchants, sporting goods retailers, especially outdoor online pure plays. And then there is the consumer who comes in to buy or has a product delivered to them, or you've got a remote delivery or the folks that'll go do assembly of a product at a consumer's home or office. But when you look at the top here, it's the consumer that creates the demand. The supply chain is supplying that demand through all these steps. Now down below are orders and forecast. And this is a constant flow. And while in the United States, they're not today being asked for forecasts, they were in the past, they may again in the future. The forecast is the first indicator that goes, if you will, from retail in the United States upstream to all these pieces. The forecast from the retailer goes to the wholesaler or the fulfillment center or the brand warehouse or the brand headquarters. A specialist there will create a forecast that goes to the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, who in turn will send out forecasts to their component folks, their component suppliers. The component suppliers will send forecasts to the raw material folks. So you got 19 steps here, including the orders and the forecasts. When it comes down to turning a forecast into a firm order that is closer to the lead time issue, let's take a quick look at that. Here's the supply chain portion from the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, to the warehouse, to the brand warehouse, to the fulfillment warehouse, to the point in the United States where the product will be distributed to you, the dealer. Now, pre-COVID, back in the day, and for decades, this was essentially a 40 to 45 day process, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. For this is West Coast oriented. For East Coast, it sometimes took a little longer, but essentially, if I'm an OEM and a brand, I would place my firm purchase order with a negotiable and a letter of credit. And the process of getting the products I had forecast and now are firm ordering from my manufacturing plant to my warehouse so I could ship it to a dealer was a 40 to 45 day process, day in, day out. What occurred during the COVID, now all the change here, as you saw this little blip, is look down at the arrow. During the pandemic, the 40 to 45 days became 70 to 75 days on average. In some cases, it's a little longer. I haven't found any situation where it's actually that much shorter, even what we've seen as to what some of the importers of record are doing these days to try to make it shorter. If anything, this is an average, and it can run a little longer depending on the delay situation we're finding at the various choke points. Now, the other important thing I mentioned that you have to keep in mind here is the demand side. The consumer is driving all this. All of the disruptions since the COVID hit and the pandemic was upon us are the direct product of consumer demand. So we have to make it clear in our heads that it's the consumer demand for stuff, for goods, that's creating this situation. And what this chart shows is the monthly change in retail spending since January 2019. And you'll notice there's two lines here. The darker line is from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a basket of all developed and developing countries. The lighter line is the US. Monthly change in retail spending since January 2019. Track it across to January 2020. The COVID hits, you see the drop, and then you see the climb out during the first quarter of 2020. And look at where that went. And what you've got now is a peak that occurred this past summer, coming down a bit now, but still, you're at about 15% above what has been the retail spending back to January of 2019. This is the driver. This is what has created the situation we're in. The American consumer buying more stuff, more goods, as opposed to services. And here's a graphic that shows that as well, from about the same time frame, January 2020 out through August of 2021. The blue line in the middle is shoppers have spent more on goods and less on service, service being eating out, movies, going to the theater, airline tickets, vacations, Airbnb, whatever. They've spent more on hard goods than they have on those services because they were confined. Without going into all the detail, that was the product of the COVID-19 and the pandemic. Consumers didn't get out, so they got online and started to buy. So all spending is the blue line. Again, you notice going to left to right. The middle line went down as we looked at the first quarter to the second quarter of the pandemic hitting in 2020, and then worked its way up. The bottom line is spending on services, going out to eat, the theater, going to the movies, vacations. The top line, the lighter line, is spending on goods. Again, typical drop, March, April 2020, and then it climbed and stayed up there. So this graphically shows the split. When we look at the future, there are two things to keep in mind, because I'll repeat this to you before we transition into our import dependency. When we look at the future, what we have to keep in mind as retailers and as suppliers to retailers is when the light line at the top, the spending on goods, merges back down, moves back down as the bottom line moves up, and consumers spend less on goods but still spend money, but a portion of what they're spending now on goods is spent back on services, going back to services for eating out, going back to the movies, going back on vacations, getting back on airplanes, so that those lines begin to merge, but in turn, they're spending less on hard goods, which means they could spend less in the bike shops. The second piece of this, I won't belabor now, but we need to keep it in mind, is the whole situation we faced with the supply chain has created what you're reading about relative to increase in prices, inflation, and the inflationary trends. So the second piece here as consumers spend less on goods, more on services, they also may spend less, period, because stuff costs more. So the answer to that, as you'll see, and I've repeated this several times, is retailers have to think about retaining consumers and those that are spending money with them now. Retention becomes a key metric and should be a key metric in the P2 groups and also for all retailers. And I'm not sure what they're barking at, but I'm not going to get up and chase them at this point. So all this leads to the import dependent market we've talked about since the beginning. The chart here shows US bicycle imports by country of origin for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And this is the way Brain reports, and that is trailing 12 months from July or to July and through July, 7 months, 2021. What this boils down to is this tracks going back 12 months. So it starts August of 2020, goes out to July 2021. It's 12-month trailing by country of origin. So the important piece here are the percentages. What I'm doing this and what I want to show is that despite the problems in 2019 with import tariffs, despite the problems in 2020 with tariffs being told or suspended, but the COVID hitting, and despite the problems of the punitive tariffs of 25% on top of regular tariffs coming back in 2021, China remains and has remained throughout this period at 92%. Just take a look at the left-hand column, 92% of US imports for the period measured. Taiwan, 5% roughly. Cambodia, a little over 1%. Vietnam, not enough to call 1%. And then other countries at less than, well, just a little over 1%, but at 1%. And here's your totals. So from a standpoint of the US market, we are totally dependent as an industry and as a market on the imports from China. So all of the problems of the logistics problems, the whole of the supply chain nightmare involving the logistics is extremely important to us. And we as a market are going to be moved back and forth. We're going to be disrupted. We're going to be in chaos, if you will, as long as we've got these multiple problems in the supply chain because of the dependency on both China and Southeast Asia. Now we'll move on to supply chain and logistics and the rolling definition, the constantly changing rolling definition of what has been referred to as normal. And you've heard my opinion that we can't go back to the way it was. There is no normal. There's no new normal, in my opinion. There's simply this rolling definition of normal that changes over time, changes month to month, by week. It's a constantly evolving disruptive process. The question will be less disruption than more disruption as we move forward. What this shows is an aerial view of, it's, as it says, the docks in Southern California's congested ports. I could show you picture after picture of this congestion, but this is part of the issue we face. In simple terms, I also want to point out that the U.S. ports of entry, where containers come in anywhere in the United States that's on an ocean, is old, has not been expanded, has not been really updated in a long time. I'm going to say decades. Compared to the Chinese or Southeast Asian ports that are new, modern, up to date, and have been expanded recently. So the simple fact is, as hard as we try, the Asian ports of demarcation where the goods coming to the US, including bicycles, depart China, Vietnam, Cambodia, tend to be new, modern, up to date, and they work 24/7. They have for years. Our ports are not as well developed, are not expanded, certainly were never expanded to the levels of this consumer demand that we see in the United States during the COVID and up to the present. So we've got a well-developed port of demarcation environment shipping goods into a less developed and struggling import port situation in the United States. Now, what's occurred relative to the freight costs, you've heard a little about. What's actually happened here in the past 2 months is two things have happened. The major shippers, and there are only 10 companies that own and control all of the container shipping in the United States. And to make it clear, there are 25 million shipping containers of all sizes available in the world and circulating in the process and the supply chains in the logistics chains. They're supported and shipped by 6,000 container ships. That's the size of the fleet, not oil or gas ships. These are container ships of all sizes. So 25 million containers in circulation throughout the world, all ports, all countries. that are moved by 6,000 container ships. The 10 companies that own and control the bulk of those ships, in fact, all of them, are moving the bigger ships to the Asian to US routes and the Asian to those European country routes that are garnering the most money for them. Because what this chart shows is the increases in the cost of containers. And they've gone upward to the point where the averages today are about $11,000 from China to the US, slightly higher depending on the contract rates. This is through October 7th. Now that's compared to less than $2,000 pre-pandemic. That is, if you went back to pre-March 2020, for the same 40-foot container, you'd pay less than $2,000 that you now pay $11,000 or more for. Now, what's occurred and what we could show here is in the past couple of months, the prices have started to come down a bit. These are all the different routes you'll notice here from China to East Asia, north to the East Coast, West Coast. It doesn't matter as much as the point that rates have started to come down. The bigger lines, Maersk being the largest, said about 3 weeks ago that they were going to freeze rates at the current levels for the next 5 months. And 4 to 5 of the big lines also joined them in doing that. Several lines said they'd already done it. Now, they weren't doing anybody any great favors here because they were freezing rates at the average of $11,000 to $12,000 per container. And they're just not going to change those for the next 5 months, which takes you past Chinese New Year, past February 2022. But there are folks that are looking at all of this detail and saying we're past the worst of it. So you could make a note that we are past the worst of it. Rates are starting to come down. Some of the pressure is starting to come down, but not at the levels that are easing the overall pressure that we're feeling in the supply chain. And the feeling is that we're not, the opinion is on from experts throughout the world at different levels is that we're not going to see this definition of normal settling down to more reliability at lower cost for transportation from Asia to the US until after Chinese New Year or after February of 2022. There are other folks in the logistics world that feel that it's actually going to be in the second half, June or July of 2022. This remains to be seen. But what the data is showing is that we, at this point, the nightmare has crested and it's starting on the downward slope at a high level. Now, this is a piece of all of the solutions that have been proposed, and we'll show a couple of those as well. Cargo ships are so stuffed that ports are struggling to unload them. What happened here is those very efficient ports in Asia, the ports of demarcation, that operate 24/7, and those shippers that realize they can now get $11,000 on average for a 40-foot container, referred to as a can, that they used to get $2,000 or less for. They have decided that they're going to put more of them on every ship. They're going to load these ships out to the max. So now the ports of demarcation are loading up containers, as many as they can get on these container ships. They're coming over to the United States to ports that are less developed, don't have the infrastructure to handle this increased volume, and it's taking longer to unload them. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Well, here's a chart that shows the percent increase in average containers per ship from the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2020. And Vancouver, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg are interesting. Look at LA. 18% more containers per ship from the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2021, which means 18% more time to unload, 18% more that's going to have to be dealt with, stacked, stored, and picked up and moved out of the port. Now, here's the kicker. Move down to Long Beach. 73% more containers per ship for the same time frame. I don't know why more of these. There evidently haven't been extreme weather events that they're running into, because we haven't received reports of these loads getting dumped in the ocean. But 73% more containers for Long Beach coming into the West Coast ports. Now, Los Angeles and Long Beach are the ports that about 40% or more of all of the US imports from Asia, and we've already shown we're import dependent, 40% of all those imports come in through these two ports. Now, there's been movement to take more more of the freight, more of the shipments. The big lines, the Maersks of this world, have started to route more of their ships up to Seattle and up to the northern West Coast ports. Some are actually going through the canal and going to Savannah and to East Coast ports. But the simple fact is that they're all overloaded. There are more containers on every ship now, as the folks that are making lots of money on shipping containers, because the demand stays, are piling them on as high as they can get them on every one of these ships. Now, a month ago, the White House appointed a port czar, one individual to work with and coordinate what was happening at the ports of entry, particularly LA and Long Beach. And we all know from what we've seen in the headlines that President Biden put a task force together, got all the major shippers and the port directors and the unions to sit down in the White House. And last week they agreed that they were going to keep the US ports open 24/7. These are the ports receiving the goods. Now, they're also shipping goods from the United States out, but the big focus is on the incoming goods, that they were going to stay open 24/7, and that they would simply be able to handle more goods. Now, this headline from Bloomberg from the 13th of October, Biden confronts supply chain crisis stretching past his grip. And I think that the White House has done everything they can do. And this is reflecting the fact that while the White House is moving on this, while they are getting the unions, the port authorities, the lines all together to make sure that they're doing what they can, there are still issues that the White House and the president can't control, can't reach out to, and in the private sector, can't bring into and try to make this an easier process. One of them I already showed you. That is the container lines putting more containers on the ships, increasing the volume that has to be worked through a port. The other is getting the warehouses around the ports to be open 3 shifts. So they are open to go into the port and ask for the goods if the port is open 24/7. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done, but the administration and Washington and the White House are trying now to do what they can to get all of the different factors, all of the different entities to work together, from the unions through the lines, through the truckers, through the ports. Now, there was some pushback in the press relative to lazy crane operators. And I'm here to tell you that that is not real. Doesn't represent, in fact, the pushback on this has been across the board from not just the unions, but the port operators, the port authorities, and the lines themselves, as well as the trucking firms, that everybody in the process, including the crane operators and the union crane operators in the ports, are doing the utmost they can and working as hard as they can. But at the same time, as I said, our friends, the shippers, are loading up as many containers based on this consumer demand as they could possibly get on the container ships. Now, continuing with our rolling definition is the port congestion that the White House is trying to deal with. And right now, what is being pointed out is Hong Kong and Shenzhen. Shenzhen is the Chinese province that Hong Kong is immediately adjacent to or contiguous with in the PRC. There are a total of, this was, by the way, also last week, there are 271 total ships with 109 of them waiting. These are container ships waiting to get into the Hong Kong Shenzhen port. 68 are import. At the point this was reported, that 61.6% congestion, a net change of 20%. Shanghai, another key port for the United States, 241 ships. So you'll see that across, and then you look down below at Long Beach and Los Angeles, that's down to 63 ships when this is reported, total, 35 waiting, 28 in port, 55.6% congestion with about 3% change. You can go through this, but the point of this whole chart is that these high numbers are now in the Chinese ports. They are going to sail to these West Coast US ports, and these numbers are going to change. And they will change on a regular rotation basis. So the congestion in the US will ebb and flow as the congestion in the Asian ports ebbs and flows, with the understanding that the Asian ports are more capable of turning freight quicker than the US ports are. Now, here's a new piece, and it's a little scary, and that's Chinese energy crisis is threatening the lengthy disruption of the global supply chain. So I think this particular headline from the Financial Times is important. Buyers in Europe and the US must wait longer for supplies as factories are forced to slash operating capacity. Heather just talked to one of the NBDA associate members who is a supplier, was talking about plants shutting down in China. Well, what's occurring here is political and practical. The bulk of the power plants in China are still coal-fired. The PRC government, including the president of China, President Xi, has told the world, the United Nations most recently, that they are going to reduce the emissions from coal-fired plants. The bureaucrats in China have taken a long time to make that happen. So they didn't smooth out the reduction in use of coal-fired plants to create energy and electricity. They've waited till the last minute, and it's ended up in a crisis situation. What this graphic shows is the power shortages that more than half of China's mainland provinces are limiting electrical use, the use of electricity for plants. So the colored in pieces, the beige, anyway, it was where curb power uses occurred. Now, again, you look at this and you wonder, what the heck's that mean? So we try to clear it up for you. To the right is a list of the primary bicycle and component manufacturing provinces of mainland China. Tianjin municipality, which is the top here, is near Beijing, and it's the only one of this list of 6 where there has not been a curb power use or power shortage. Sichuan, I love their food. Sichuan, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong all have had power shortages. All are centers of bicycle and component manufacturing and e-bike manufacturing. Now, for your reference, this is Hong Kong, where I've got the cursor right here in Guangdong province. Okay, and Taiwan is right across from Fujian. Right here. Now I'm murdering my Chinese pronunciations. My Mandarin pronunciations are terrible. But the reality of the chart is that here's Taiwan. It's no surprise that, by the way, these are the major manufacturing provinces for bicycles, bicycle components in mainland China as export plants, along with what we see in Sichuan, which, by the way, is actually limited to specialty e-bikes. So the vast majority of the manufacturing is along the coast here, and the bulk of it is centered in these 4 provinces. The bottom line is, though, they've all suffered from curbed power use, which is partly because of a coal shortage, which in turn is part of the bureaucratic response to the government, the central government's push to reduce coal-fired plant use and to reduce the amount of pollutants that are being put into the Chinese atmosphere and air. Now, is this soluble? It's going to be a long, hard winter, and this is going to be an ongoing problem, but it's adding to the delays. It's shutting plants down so they can't produce. This is over and above the COVID problem, and this is now moving into a response to the climate crisis issue. So this takes us to what can bike shops do? And believe me, we could certainly talk more about these other issues, but to give you an idea of what shifted and changed, as Heather said, this is an update as to what's shifted and changed and become primary issues since the last reporting. And from the standpoint of bike shops, we think staying flexible is extremely important to respond to what is an ongoing series of disruptions to the bicycle supply chain. So communicate with key suppliers and brands no less than weekly, and make sure that you stay on your suppliers and brands to get current information. If you can't get information about the supply chain or logistics, contact the NBDA. They'll do their best to get a hold of people like us who will try to get information for you. Get clarification about your options as a specialty bicycle retailer, and certainly under any of the authorized dealer agreements that you signed and have in place. What can you adjust? What will the brand allow you to do? And also investigate, in the same context, the availability of other brands and products and what their requirements are, so that you could see what you could do to expand and make sure that you are providing the products you need for consumers. Now, I will tell you that I said the apex or the arc had been reached, where experts are saying the worst of it's over, but there are still major problems and disruptions to work through between now and the first quarter of next year, and possibly into the first half of next year. We are seeing warehouses in the United States, bicycle-related warehouses, beginning to fill up. Some products are readily available, particularly in the juvenile or smaller bike side. E-bikes have shorter lead times than regular acoustic bikes. So you are beginning to see the supply chain begin to catch up in the United States. You still need, however, to look at alternatives. You need to investigate regional and locally made products. And more of them are cropping up, but you certainly can help them if you take a look at what's available and what you can add to your line of merchandise that would be nearshored or reshored into the US or closer to the US market. And certainly investigate other related and crossover outdoor products. The Big Gear show back in the second quarter is a good example of bike shop owners coming to that show because it was outdoor and looking at crossover products that fit their markets, that fit their customers, that fit their retail environment, and allowed them to expand their product base, their merchandising base, and their profit base. Now, we also advocate thinking outside the box. And for those dealers that haven't yet grabbed onto e-bikes, please do. E-bikes are becoming extremely important to the market. They are a growing category. We think, like many others, that e-bikes will be the largest category of bicycle. Sorry for those of you that thought you lost my sound, I was actually clearing my throat. Take a look at cargo and family bikes. Again, we think cargo bikes, electric assist, are going to be a big category in the future. And we see many of the major brands looking at them. We see new cargo bike brands coming into the market. We also see really good, important developments in electric propulsion that helps the whole of the cargo and family bike category. Family bikes, by the way, we mean by that long beam, the long bikes that the extra cycles of this world provide to the market. Recumbents are our growth category. They've graduated to being a growth category, and there are major recumbent brands in the United States. Now, they're dependent on imported componentry, but they're one of the only bicycle manufacturing plants in the United States is an e-bike plant. It is Cat Trike in Orlando, Florida. They make frames and forks and then in turn have imported componentry, and they also have electric assist in their lines. TerraTrike out of Michigan is also another one to look at. And then also custom and what you can do with custom product, and whether you want to bring a custom builder into your bike shop as part and parcel of your offerings, but also of your experience that you're offering to consumers. Indoor cycling is very climate related. We think a growth category, not only devoting space in your shop where your cyclists can come in and rent a smart trainer for a period of time, connect to the internet, compete and ride, but also what you can provide in the way of equipment for that category, rent to buy and leasing options that you can offer, the circular economy, previously owned, used bikes. We think it's a huge growth category, along with what you could offer in your community in the way of guided tours. Now, I haven't gone away. I'm trying to advance my slides here. Okay, I went too fast. Okay, the future. We've said this before. We simply would like you to focus on the fact that the great tragedy of COVID-19 and the climate crisis have created opportunities. Opportunities that especially bike retailers can certainly take care of or take advantage of in the market. And that's part of being flexible, and that's part of thinking outside of the box. The bicycling relevance index that we talk about, or the perception that bicycles and bicycling are viable solutions, we think has risen dramatically during the tragedy of COVID-19, during the pandemic. While the industry spent huge amounts of money to make bicycles relevant pre-COVID, the COVID created a situation, unfortunately out of fear, but it still created a perception among the public that bicycles and bicycling are viable solutions, and we need to build on that going forward. 2020, 2021 were inflection points. They were points where the consumer changed, where the market changed, where we saw in a short period of time dramatic change that, again, become opportunities. And inflection points, by their very nature, economists tell us, will either result in very good or very bad changes in the market. We think they'll be very good. That the bicycling relevance index has created a situation where the perception of bicycles and bicycling is viable, it's good, it'll move forward to the future, take advantage of it as consumers switch from buying goods to services and react to what could be inflationary pressure. The added bonus we have is the sales dollars and revenue brought in by this great tragedy. Use it wisely. Invest in becoming members of the National Bicycle Dealers Association. If you're a member of the NBDA, invest in becoming a member of a P2 group. Make sure that you are plugged into a network that will help you in the future to grow your revenue, to maintain your customer base, to increase your retention rates, which become extremely important as we look to the future, because the American consumer is going to move in some degree, unknown at this point, from buying goods to also buying services. And then in turn, the inflationary pressure will take effect, and we'll see if the overall declines. That all means they'll buy less from the standpoint of our products. And we need to make sure that we retain as many of those customers as we can, both for now and going forward. So it's up to you. Make the perception your future and work hard at making sure that you're retaining customers and you're taking the great bonus you got from this great tragedy, the COVID-19 and pandemic, and turning it into a good future for you and your business. So in summary, we supply chain at the order and forecast flow. We've looked at why and how we are an import dependent market, and that's not going to change short term. Whatever happens with this ebb and flow, with this new definition of rolling normal, is we're tied to it for a pretty good period of time until nearshoring and reshoring actually become viable in our environment. So we're an import dependent market. We've got a supply chain and logistics that is going through change, disruption, and the definition of that supply chain is rolling. It's changing. It's evolving. Therefore, bike shops need to stay flexible. They need to start thinking outside of the box if they haven't already, and they've got to look to the future as a great opportunity for what can be and how you can make the future reality. So with that, I'm going to get back on screen and ask Rochelle and Heather if we have any questions. Free questions if they'd like as well.
All right, so if you do have questions, put them in either the chat or the Q&A, and we can see them and relate them to Jay so that we can get your questions answered right now. We have a comment, actually, not a question. Larry says, 1,000 Catracks ready in Florida waiting for one item. SRAM 10-speed derailleur.
Well, I'm not sure if that's a pitch for Catrike, but yes, that is the issue that the supply chain has created, which is if you're dependent upon the componentry like the OEMs are in Asia that is manufactured there, the lead times have gone out. I was talking to somebody yesterday who mentioned to me that a particular type of suspension fork they needed for a new e-bike product currently had a 200-day lead time. And that was from the far left of our chart, from the supply side of componentry to the OEM. So this is part of the disruption that's going on over and above and or inclusive of, I guess, what we just described, and certainly would be affected by the power shortage issue.
We do have a question that just came in. Do you think we'll have an overcorrection and there will be a glut of product soon, meaning in the next 18 months?
Possible. And I say possible because we talked in one of our early webinars about the bullwhip effect, which is actually a formal effect. It's the idea that essentially that as you go up the supply chain from the right to the left, back to the OEMs and to their suppliers, you over order. And it's the tendency to say, I've got a consumer order for, as a retailer, I'll order more to make sure my shelves aren't empty. As a wholesaler, to order more to make sure my shelves aren't empty, and so on. So that you've got an over ordering process upstream. Well, eventually that works its way through the pipe in the form of product that shows up at the dock or the warehouse or your store that you have to stock. The history of supply chains, in particular our supply chain in the American bicycle business, is that we don't control the spigot as well as we should. We don't fine tune it. So we tend to react in big pieces. And that's just a long way around saying, yeah, it's quite possible we could have an overstocking situation or a glut in the market. It's going to have to be looked at very carefully. And brands will look at it differently than dealers, and dealers are going to have to make sure they're looking very carefully at their inventory and their situation. As a KPM, look at the inventory to sales ratio and making sure you've got that balanced along with your GMROI, your gross margin return on inventory.
All right, one more question comes from Hermosa Sycoroy. They say, why would the world's most innovative country, the USA, not update its import ports? Here in LA, we hear the union has a major hand in throughput. Is our port problem all union related?
To begin with the latter portion, no, it's not union related. There's nothing that I've seen through this morning that indicates it is union related. Now, will it be in the future when it comes down to negotiations on a contract sometime in 2022? Could be. It's not now. The unions are doing their absolute best to cooperate and to make sure that we've got the throughput. How could this happen? Well, it's capitalism. The folks that own and operate the ports and make money from it were not recapitalizing because there was no need to. The supply chain to the United States was fine-tuned, not just for bikes, but for everything. It was fine-tuned. It had operated the same way for decades. And the goods coming in came in steady flows. The turnover was steady. You saw in the charts the way the consumer ordered was fairly steady going out. If you go back in time a couple of decades, you won't see any of the undulations or these huge upticks that we've seen since the first quarter of 2020. So how did we let that happen? How did we let our bridges decay? How did we let our roads decay? I live in a snowy part of the country. How did we let potholes develop? We simply did not pay attention to the infrastructure. We're now beginning to look at it and need to update it, but updating it in the middle of this kind of demand on the part of the consumer is not the right time to do it. So we didn't pay attention. The investment wasn't made. Those ports were doing fine based on the way it did operate, the way the inflow and the demand operated pre-pandemic. So it's not an accusation, it's a simple fact. And the unions are not to blame here. The unions are cooperating. And as I say, they won't become a factor until we get to negotiating the next round of contracts next year in the first quarter.
All right, I think that's all the live questions we have. Jay, if anybody has questions who's watching the recording, can they contact you?
Yes, they can either, if they want to contact the NBDA, I know you'll get it to me, or they can contact me directly. And I've been pushing the button to get the next slide to get my contact information up and just don't seem to be making it work. So Rochelle and I have had long conversations about why I can't get this last slide to come up. And I don't know. But at any rate, yes, they can contact me, jay@humanpoweredsolutions.com. And I'm also available through the NBDA.
Perfect. So that's jay@humanpoweredsolutions.com or info@nbda.com. And we'll get your questions over to Jay and we'll get them answered. So thank you for being here, Jay. Thank you for the information. We really appreciate it, all the work you put into it. And we'll see you for the next installment in December.
Yes, looking forward to it. And let me know if you got any members that have any questions in between. I'll do my best to help you answer them.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.